Russia's invasion of Ukraine has failed in its original objectives, and has forced Russia to recalibrate to a form of warfare that Moscow intended to avoid. What was supposed to be a quick special military operation has turned into a protracted, costly war. But why did this happen? The long answer is, it's complicated. But if I had to quickly explain this in one word, I'd say logistics. But not really just logistics as you may perceive it. It's not all about the sufficient and timely supply of troops, which certainly is a critical and important piece of this puzzle, but it's also the way that the war is planned, and the way the plan is executed. The best strategists understand their logistics, and the defeated strategists do not. To explain why, let's take a look at the 1991 Gulf War and compare it to the war in Ukraine. Both are completely different wars in reality. However, Putin may have intended for the war in Ukraine to look a lot more like the Gulf War than it actually turned out. That said, there are some key practices and procedures that the US and the coalition implemented long before the war that Russia did not themselves. These practices and procedures helped the coalition absolutely overwhelm the massive Iraqi army in a matter of weeks, while the failure to recognize and implement these practices for Russia has cost them their war. While it all sounds simple, the reality is significantly more complex, so let's dig in. We'll start by looking at the Gulf War to understand its scope, significance, challenges, solutions, and impacts, and then we'll transition to the war in Ukraine and go through the same elements while also comparing it to the Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait with a desire to annex. This led to an immediate international response condemning the invasion, with George H.W. Bush in the front. Bush ordered then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to work with General Norman Schwarzkopf to formulate a plan to defend Saudi Arabia from any follow-on Iraqi assaults, and to develop an operational plan to intervene in Kuwait and force Iraq back across the border. By the end of August, US troops were already beginning to arrive in Saudi Arabia. This began Operation Desert Shield, which would go on for months as diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. In January, the UN called for Iraq to be expelled from Kuwait by any means necessary, no later than January 15, 1991. Throughout the 4 months between the initial US troops landed in Saudi Arabia and the UN deadline of January 15th, the US surged a ton of forces into Saudi Arabia. This force is what would be called a force projection force, meaning that these troops would be entering into an area where it had no prior relationships with the host nation, had not interacted with its logistics infrastructure, and had to develop all the systems and infrastructure to support itself as it entered into the country. Contrast this with what's called a forward deployed force, where the force does have infrastructure that can support it already established, as well as relationships with the host nation. An example of a forward deployed force would be the US forces in Europe, where the NATO alliance helps generate support and infrastructure to sustain the force. At this time in 1990, the US and Saudi Arabia were only beginning to redefine their military relationship, and US forces had to bring everything that they needed to survive and fight, while concurrently working with Saudi Arabia to create logistics contracts and infrastructure to better enable the incoming surge of forces. To better understand how gargantuan of an undertaking that this was, consider that for most of the US force preparing to land in Saudi Arabia, they would need to travel either 8,000 miles by air or 10,000 miles by sea, using 10,000 air sorties and 500 ships to get all 540,000 troops, as well as their tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment, food, fuel, water purification systems, and other types of sustainment equipment into theater. US Logistics Sustainment Forces, which supported the entire movement, had to open this theater by developing the infrastructure capable of actually physically receiving these forces, establish locations in Saudi Arabia for these forces to physically stage and defend against potential Iraqi assaults, and then, when it was finally finished, withdraw back to the US and Europe. Not only that, but the combat forces coming in weren't trained for a war in the Middle East. They were training for a war with the Soviet Union. So many of them had olive green camo that would have to be repainted in the Saudi Arabia desert to desert tan, which meant even more material that needed to be brought in, more time that US forces need to spend before they were combat ready, and more contractors and personnel that would be needed to support the deployment. The US contracted with civilian Saudi trucking companies to get help using all kinds of wheeled vehicles to help transport material across the area of operations. In total, more than 117,000 wheeled vehicles sustained the 540,000 troops, as well as their 12,000 tanks and armored vehicles. Even by the January 15th deadline, US troops still weren't completely ready to fight Iraq. 2 US US corps were mispositioned and had to switch places, and a significant piece of the US force would have to race westward in a flanking maneuver, which would ultimately push into Iraq and cut off Iraqi forces in Kuwait. None of this could happen, though, until the air campaign had destroyed Iraq's ability to observe and monitor US forces. In fact, everything that the US forces had to do prior to the air campaign had to be defensive in nature to deceive Iraqi forces in both their intent and their capability, and thus control the information domain. What was originally planned to be a 2-week air campaign became a 3-week campaign, where US forces decimated Iraqi command and control and masses of forces, while ground forces swung west to prepare for the ground offensive. Logistics forces not only spent this time supporting and switching the places of the 2 US corps, they also created forward logistics bases to enable the forward movement of forces. Finally, on February 24th, US forces pushed forward, decimating the Iraqi Republican Guard in Iraq and cutting off Iraqi regular forces in Kuwait. This maneuver caused the regular forces to panic and retreat into Iraq, where they were targeted from the air. In only 3 days, US forces decimated the Iraqi army and liberated Kuwait. This wasn't the end of the mission for the logistics sustainment forces, who now had to redeploy all the US forces back to their home bases throughout Europe and the United States. Absolutely none of this success would have been possible had General Schwarzkopf not understood the critical role that logistics sustainment played in mission success. He accurately read Iraq's center of gravity at a strategic and operational level, and was able to target those centers of gravity while staying within the limits of his logistics support. Parts of his and his junior commanders' plans even had to be redrawn to fall within the levels of logistics support that they had. These commanders, covering not only completely different military branches, but also commanding forces from multiple different countries, many of whom hadn't trained or integrated with US forces previously. Joining different militaries together and maintaining unity of effort is hard, and requires a significant level of trust and understanding across the board, and here it succeeded. Air power also played a very critical role, preventing Iraqi long-range fires from significantly disrupting US logistics efforts and the ability to mass forces. Iraqi Scuds posed a significant threat and did target US forces in Saudi Arabia, which led to nearly 24 dead and over 100 wounded. Regardless, the logistics forces were able to successfully execute their mission. That was in 1991, and since then the US military has undergone modernization and reformation to meet the demands of the modern battlefield after 2 decades of conflict across the globe. Russia has also undergone dramatic modernization and reforms, and the belief in 1991 was the same as in 2021, that is that Russia was a near peer to the United States and could be capable of a similar type of success against an inferior enemy as what the US had against Iraq. There were some key issues though that hamstrung Russia's readiness for the war in Ukraine, as well as their ability to adjust course if a plan fell apart or obstacles were encountered. One of the most significant issues has long been corruption, and corruption tends to hit logistics forces the hardest, as it's difficult to maintain proper accounting for equipment and resources, which opens opportunities for theft. Russia knows this issue well, but it also extends to readiness reporting across the formation. Many combat units would report that they met readiness levels, meaning that their equipment worked, their troops were adequately trained and equipped, and the unit was prepared to go and fight when called upon. False readiness reports permeated the force, which may have given Putin the impression that his military was prepared to fight and win a war against Ukraine. It may not have been confirmation bias for Putin. He may have operated off of the data that he was supplied. And if that data is based on false reporting, then you have bigger problems than you might think. Another issue that contrasts with Schwarzkopf preparations for the Gulf War was the failure to deceive the enemy and control the information space. This may simply be a product of the times we live in now, where anyone can go on Maxar online and download up-to-date satellite imagery, a luxury that only US forces and few others enjoyed in 1991. Iraq, by contrast, could only observe with air reconnaissance and ground observation. Throughout 2021, everyone who had a computer could observe the buildup of Russian combat power across the border with Ukraine and in Belarus, as well as, more importantly, along the border in late 2021 and January 2022. Russia wasn't able to hide that it was building up for something, and the development of logistics bases showed Russia was preparing to actually fight and had the intent to fight, as without them, Russia couldn't sustain anything other than a quick incursion across the border. A third issue that ultimately hit Russia hard was its logistics reliance on rail. Something that needs to be noted is that rail is an incredibly powerful transportation method when it can be used, and Russia uses trains extremely well. Russia even has the benefit of Ukraine's rail network being compatible with Russian trains, which operate on a 15 120mm gauge, the same as Russia's rail network. For contrast, the rest of Europe operates on a 1435mm gauge. Their rail network was also linked, so Russian trains could run throughout Ukraine without the need to create new lines or cross-load equipment and material to new trains in country. And while these were benefits, Russia would ultimately still have to capture Ukrainian rail hubs to sustain their offensive, and would struggle to sustain its forces the further they got from those railheads. To compensate, Russia needed to rely on wheeled vehicles, something that they appear to have realized too late with the railing in of civilian vehicles marked for military use. The benefit of wheeled transportation platforms obviously is mobility. While you also sacrifice the load that, say, a train can carry, you benefit from the ability to physically drive, say, a truckload of ammunition to the infantrymen that need it. Having said this, you still need to develop logistics areas the further forward you need to move. And this is where we get to the point where Russia actually began their assault. In 1991, the US dedicated the better part of 3 weeks to destroy Iraq's ability to observe and track US forces, as well as its ability to communicate with its forward elements. In effect, the air attack blinded and somewhat muted Iraqi forces. This effect can cause panic in a force, especially when it's already overmatched. By the time US ground forces finally moved ahead, Iraqi forces were in disarray, and 3 days later, the war was over. Russia, on the other hand, launched its air campaign at the same time as its ground campaign, after months of allowing Ukraine to observe its buildup and accurately gauge both its strength and the intent of these forces. This allowed Ukraine to negate the impacts of the air campaign by dispersing forces and leaving military sites which would ultimately be targeted, while also targeting Russian ground forces in areas of weakness. And this takes us to the Russian command, where we observe that Russia not only lacked respect for logistics, but also failed to properly plan this campaign while subsequently failing to achieve unity of effort. We've already discussed their logistical strengths and weaknesses, but what does that mean for their initial war plan? For Russia to have succeeded in, say, taking Kiev, they only needed to commit to logistically sustaining that one line of effort. Let's assume that Russia was correct in assessing that Kiev was Ukraine's center of gravity, and that the overthrow of the Zelensky government would have sped the collapse of the Ukrainian military throughout the rest of the country. The fact that they were only miles outside of the city with a significant amount of combat power shows just how close they were to actually succeeding in this objective. However, this failed because they couldn't logistically sustain that combat force, and shortages of fuel, food, ammunition, and water forced Russia to withdraw these forces back into Belarus and redeploy them to the Donbass and southern Ukraine. A huge element of this failure was the inability by Russia to secure an air corridor where they could fly additional VDV forces into Hostomel Airport, to include the airlift of equipment and material sustainment. Russia, organically lacking in wheeled transportation for the purposes of logistics support, struggled to generate the throughput necessary to sustain their combat forces around Kiev. Instead, Russia had committed to 3 lines of effort, where the assault on Kiev was only one, and resourced all 3 lines of effort equally. Not only did this take away critical combat power away from Kiev, it took logistics sustainment resources and attention away from Kiev. This is where we observe that Russia failed to plan at an operational level. Had they identified and respected the logistical limits of their force, they would have known that they couldn't resource 3 simultaneous lines of effort, and would have to prioritize their most critical LOE, that being the siege of Kiev. This is also where we can observe that Russia failed to achieve unity of effort, something that was absolutely critical for the US in 1991, and something that Ukraine has managed to achieve throughout the war, while Russia itself has failed to do so. Instead of establishing a single unified command that would oversee the invasion, where a single commander would make critical decisions based on an operational vision, Russia instead opted to delegate the lines of effort to the different heads of military districts. In effect, each line of effort, while ultimately designed to invade Ukraine, operated in different manners, and didn't coordinate or complement each other as complete as would happen in a unified command structure. With each LOE equally resourced and commanded by entirely different command staffs, it was initially challenging to assess which line of effort was the primary and which ones were supporting. This challenge no doubt extended to the Russian military, which again impacts logisticians the hardest. Combat forces attrit the enemy and shape the battlefield, but they're useless without logistics sustainment. Like a financial statement, your logistics tell where your priorities are, and if you prioritize everything equally, then you really have no priorities at all. This starved the line of effort towards Kiev and ultimately caused it to fail. It's after this collapse where we again see the Russian military leadership's failure in operational planning yet again. A huge part of mission planning is the creation of courses of action, or COAs. These help a commander to better adapt to different conditions, and this also helps maintain momentum in cases where things aren't quite going according to plan. When the siege of Kiev failed, Russia failed to maintain offensive momentum, and the methods they used to regenerate combat strength kicked off too late and in too small of scope. This indicates that they did not properly plan alternate courses of action to react to a failed siege of Kiev or other setbacks. And since then, it's caused Russia to ultimately lose the ability to achieve their original objectives of overthrowing the Ukrainian government, and instead having to settle with the annexation of 2 newly captured Ukrainian territories and the expansion of control over 2 other provinces where they had already been fighting since 2014. With all of this being said, to fully understand the breadth of the failure, remember that this is not happening across the planet from Russia just like the Gulf War was with the US. This is all taking place along Russia's border, in a country where they would, theoretically, be better situated to logistically support an invasion. Russia's failure to properly plan and resource their invasion has left them in the mess that they find themselves in today, and it gives lessons for leaders worldwide, whether leaders of small businesses or leaders in the US military, to never underestimate the criticality of logistics and the importance of good and proper operational planning. If we had to boil it down to a phrase, just remember that operational planning tells you what you want to do, and logistics tells you what you can do. Comment your thoughts. I'd love to hear your input on this complex topic. Also, leave a like if you got something out of this video. It really helps this video reach other nerds just like us.